I cannot say enough about my appreciation for the Community Church of Boston. From the time that I've worked in the building, it's still one of the most cherished times in my life, straight out of grad school, taking my first job, taking on what was then the aftermath of a 9/11 environment in which Islamophobia had gone completely out of control, anti-Arab racism, as well as American foreign policy being in a pretty rough shape. And it is kind of tragic that we are here today with all of these things having gotten substantially worse in this particular moment. Islamophobia had kind of died down towards the end of the first Trump administration because even though he was the most Islamophobic of any president the United States has ever had, he was such an agent of chaos that Islamophobia was no longer the dominant feature of our political discourse because he had created so much chaos on every other front. And yet, what we see now is that even though this chaos persists and has gotten even worse with this administration, Islamophobia is still being thrust back into the forefront in a way. And on the back of 18 months of genocide in Gaza, it is difficult to know what is left to say, to be honest with you. I mean, whenever there is an invitation to speak, it's difficult to kind of overcome that bit of feeling of despair of what is there left to say that has not been said over the past 18 months. We have a unique event unfolding in Gaza, unlike anything else we've ever seen in history. It's not because genocide hasn't been committed before. Obviously, there have been many genocides in the world, unfortunately. But this is the first live streamed genocide that everybody can access on their phones and their social media feeds. Day in and day out, you're able to turn on that screen and watch children being shredded by the Israeli military using American supplied weapons. And there's no end in sight for the way things are going right now. There is a divide in the way that Americans understand what's unfolding in Gaza that is divided by age. And it's not difficult to understand why there is that divide. There are younger people who primarily access information through the internet. And there's an older generation that still relies on cable news and legacy media to consume information. And so when you look at opinion polls, you see that younger Americans are far more upset by this policy, think continued American support for Israel's genocide is not a moral path forward, that there should be an end to that support. But you look at a generation of sort of the leading politicians in this country that still rely on legacy media, you see that there is still a functioning in an outdated mindset in which you just reflexively support Israel, right or wrong. It's not even a topic of discussion or debate. Our politicians function like malfunctioning bots that are programmed to just repeat, I support Israel, Israel has the right to defend itself, no matter what you ask them in relation to Israel. That is the only answer that they have. And if the media did its job of exposing the American public to what is unfolding, I have no doubt that this genocide would end within a couple of weeks. That if Americans were subject of all ages, voters had thrust into their face day in and day out the consequences of American policy, the actual impact on real human beings, there would not be another politician in this country that can get up and say, I stand in support of this mass slaughter of children. They can only support it using euphemisms because people don't see the consequences of America's actions. And that is what has been depressing about all of this. Even recently, protesting the Trump's fascism and authoritarian overreach, you had somebody like Cory Booker take a stand for 24 hours on the Senate floor, filibustering, insisting that we have to address the deep and dark policies that Trump has sprung on all of us, and yet immediately turns around after that and votes to send more weapons to Israel while Israel is in the midst of committing this genocide. To then have to withstand, to endure all this rhetoric across all the networks about what a brave and conscientious person Cory Booker is for standing up to Donald Trump in light of what he has turned around and done is frankly suffocating for those of us who are paying attention to American foreign policy and what is unfolding there. It's not as if Cory Booker himself gets anything out, supports the killing of Palestinian children because he benefits in some way from that killing. It is purely political cowardice that we see in our political class of politicians who want to take the easy way out, to not engage on difficult topics. And the autopilot mode, the default mode, is to just say you support Israel and keep sending them weapons. And we desperately have to change that. We are, in my view, witnessing the darkest chapter in American politics of my lifetime, at least. Donald Trump has come along. The reason why he has come along, again, something that you don't see acknowledged in our media discourse about this, is in part because of what Joe Biden has done in Gaza. It is because, a pretty significant percentage of voters could not bring themselves to turn out and vote for an administration that has insisted on no accountability for Israel in the midst of the worst crimes imaginable, and said that they were not going to deviate from that policy, causing significant suppression, effectively, of progressive turnout, because people cannot bring themselves to vote for this atrocity. And that's part of the reason why Donald Trump has come along. And Donald Trump has come along now talking about the full ethnic cleansing of Gaza, building on what the Democrats have enabled through their policy of spinelessness, of never standing up to Israel anyway. And Donald Trump, frankly, is a dark force in many other areas. He is dismantling entire government agencies that are funded by Congress. He's doing so unconstitutionally. There is just naked corruption and conflict of interest all over this administration, in which they cut the needs of the American people in order to turn around and give more money and tax breaks and government deals to their corporate friends. There is a shutting down of corporate accountability across the board, of cases being dropped that are against corporate wrongdoers, of the CFPB being dismantled, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the agency that is responsible for returning billions of dollars to American consumers that are stolen by corporations. That agency is now under the threat of dismantlement by this administration. And you have an acceleration towards climate disaster by abandoning any sensible climate policies and doubling and tripling down on fossil fuels. Every way that you look at it, Trump is a serious threat, frankly, to human survival on this planet. And in the short term, where you see the most egregious fascist assault that we're witnessing domestically is the attempt to dismantle the First Amendment by going after people who are speaking out against the atrocities in Gaza. People who are critics of Israel's government are now being treated like criminals by our government, being told that to oppose genocide is equal to supporting terrorism. You could not get any more Orwellian than that. That the definition of terrorism is the use of violence against civilians to produce political outcomes. This is transparently what Israel is doing on a genocidal scale. And you have people who are objecting to that state-sponsored genocidal level of terrorism being accused of supporting terrorism on account of their opposition to terrorism. That is what we're witnessing. And people are being snatched up from their homes, off of streets, being thrown in dungeons under threat of deportation. You have sometimes documented immigrants, not just undocumented immigrants, being shipped off to torture chambers in other countries. It is a very, very deeply dark moment right now that we're witnessing. But it doesn't get worse in its most egregious form in this moment than it is with the literal shredding of dozens of children every single day. And in one case, just a few weeks ago, it was the killing of up to 200 Palestinian children in a single day. We have become so numb as a society that you can commit the most egregious massacre of children in history in a single day. No other massacre compares. And yet you can still proceed with our mainstream media not acknowledging it, our politicians not addressing it, as if everything is normal, as if Palestinian death is normal. And it's all built on this lie that what Israel is doing is a targeted operation of which Palestinian civilians are an unintended consequence when they are injured or killed, when anybody who is paying attention to the details of what we're seeing understands very well that this is a deliberate war on the civilian population in Gaza. You have reports of doctors that visit who say we've never seen so many single bullet sniper wounds to the heads and chests of children in what is an obvious pattern of deliberately murdering children. You have Israeli policies by intelligence analysts that are leaked in the Israeli press talking about the deliberate targeting of what they call power targets, high-rise residential buildings without any warning and toppling them down. We have this recent massacre just a couple of days ago of a Red Cross crew in Gaza, where Israel ambushed them, even though they were obviously marked as medical personnel with sirens on and all. They killed them, execution style, and then they buried their bodies and the ambulances to try to cover up what they had done. And time and again, Israel lies about all these incidents. And then when they're caught lying, they backtrack on the lie step by step until the thing is just out of the news cycle and nobody's talking about it anymore. You have Israel telling Palestinians to go to safe zones to get out of harm's way, and then drops massive 2,000-pound bombs on those safe zones, killing endless people. The bombing of tents that civilians run and shelter in. The literal burning alive of men, women, and children. It is genuinely difficult to try to convey the absolute madness of the fact that we live now in a society in which you can carry this on in a live stream fashion for 8 months straight, 18 months straight, and still proceed as if life is normal, and still have entire political conversations and shows about anything else. How can you proceed talking about anything else when children are literally being shredded with American money and weapons being used by a genocidal foreign government? And what's worse is that there was a time under the Biden administration in which everybody understood that Israel was committing genocide. Anybody who's, again, paying attention understood very well that the Biden administration was never going to challenge Israel to a point of actually putting an end to this genocide. But there was some tension. There was tension in Biden saying, we desperately need a ceasefire agreement. Israel is killing too many civilians. We don't approve. There was all this back and forth that forced Israel, was costing Israel on a PR front, in that they could not be open about the fact that they want to commit genocide. They had to pretend that they have no intentions of occupying Gaza or taking it over, and this is all an operation. It was just an avalanche of lies. And when Trump comes along and proposes the complete ethnic cleansing of Gaza as his official plan, it opens the door for Israel to no longer pretend. And so when you listen to what Netanyahu says in more recent interviews, the plan right now is to continue squeezing Gaza, and by squeezing they mean divide up and bomb and obliterate people left and right until Hamas surrenders. That is one stated goal. But then it's followed up with, once Hamas surrenders, then we begin the implementation of Trump's plan. Trump's plan being, quote unquote, voluntary displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. Of course, for any thinking human being, there's nothing voluntary about destroying people's lives in a place, destroying a place's ability to sustain life, and then ask people if they want to get away or if they want to stay. That is forced displacement. That is ethnic cleansing. That is genocide towards ethnic cleansing, and it is now the official policy of Israel, declared out in the open, no longer pretending, and it has the full backing of our government, with no one in sight at this point who's able to put a stop to it. It is a deeply, deeply dark moment right now, and it is difficult to look for signs of hope in all of this. And from Israel's perspective, it's not even only about Gaza. They want to entrench their dominance over the entire region. That is why they are, even though they got the ceasefire from Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hezbollah agreed to essentially withdraw completely from the border area, and yet Israeli bombings of Lebanon are practically daily. You have the same in Syria, where the last government fell and the new government has come along and said, we don't want confrontation with Israel of any kind. And that has not stopped, despite the fact that the new Syrian government is completely passive in the face of Israel. This did not stop Israel from substantially expanding its territory in Syria, of bombing Syrian military facilities, of killing Syrian protesters who are protesting against Israeli occupation of Syrian territory. And the violence just continues again, day after day after day. That is what a lot of Western mainstream corporate media refers to as a lull or a ceasefire or a time of quiet. As long as the killing is one-sided, that is not worthy of registering on anybody's radar. Now, the second there is a rocket that flies out of Lebanon or Syria to hit Israel in return, you will instantly hear corporate media focus on it and describe Israel's actions then as retaliation to whatever happened, because we're constantly in this broken default of treating Israel as responding to everything instead of acknowledging the obvious fact that Israel is an occupying force today in Lebanon, in Palestine, and in Syria. A militarily occupying force and an occupation is inherently an offensive posture. There is no such thing as the occupied people initiating violence, because the occupation itself is violence. And on top of that, we see Israel's daily bombings. It's not just the occupation as a static, but it's a very, very violent occupation and a murderous one that takes the lives of Palestinians, Lebanese, and Syrians alike, with Gaza obviously suffering the brunt of it, and now Israeli military operations expanding in the West Bank with tens of thousands of Palestinians displaced there as well. And the big thing that Israel is after right now is, of course, Iran. Israel knows it can't take on Iran by itself, and they are desperate to drag the United States into a confrontation with Iran. And the Trump administration might just be stupid and reckless enough to fall for it. We are told that the reason we have a problem with Iran is because they're not allowed to have nuclear weapons and we're worried about their nuclear program. Before we get to the merits of that argument, just consider for a moment that the United States is a nuclear-armed state that has, in fact, used nuclear weapons in war before. Israel is also a nuclear-powered state, and they are going to enforce Iran not getting nuclear weapons. The moral hypocrisy just described in that, in the idea that the rules apply for some countries but not others, that Israel is entitled to get things that Iran is not entitled to, is itself tells the entire story in a way. But even if you were to accept that and take a realistic perspective of saying, yes, the United States is the dominant force, it gets to allow some countries to develop nuclear weapons, even within that, there is no indication that Israel is developing a nuclear weapon. That is the assessment of every intelligence agency in the world, including the American intelligence agencies and the UN monitors. And there was a deal already that guaranteed that Iran could not one day develop nuclear weapons. That was the Obama nuclear deal, in which there was full monitoring of Iran's nuclear weapons program. Iran's nuclear program. It's not a weapons program. It's a nuclear energy program, to ensure that they cannot enrich uranium to a point that could one day potentially become a threat. And yet, Donald Trump, with the support of Israel, came along and tore up that deal. And that exposes the lie that the concern is about Israel's nuclear program. Because if it was, that was a solved problem. You had an agreement in place in which the US lifted sanctions off of Iran in exchange for Iran allowing the US and the international community to monitor their nuclear energy program to make sure it can never be turned into a nuclear weapons program. The reason why they tore up that deal is because what they want from Iran is more than just a nuclear program. What they want is complete Iranian submission to Israeli dominance in the region. That is what is being demanded. And in pursuit of that, you have Netanyahu right now pushing very aggressively to get Trump to bomb Iran for him. And we have a posture from Donald Trump right now that is extremely hawkish and aggressive, building up the US military forces in the region, with constantly hinting at the possibility of bombing Iran, giving them an ultimatum and saying that military force could be used very soon. And that is the climate that we're in today. And when Donald Trump creates a financial crisis of epic proportions with his moronic implementation of tariffs that are not strategic, are not thoughtful, it's just a ham-handed way of dealing with the world that ends up causing an economic crisis across the world and in the US. One of the ways in which Trump can distract from that failure is by launching a new war. He himself has talked about wars as means of distraction when he was criticizing other presidents in the past, saying that this is what they do to distract from their failures. And we seem to be poised right now for that potential war. And a war with Iran would be unbelievably catastrophic. It would be substantially worse. I mean, as insane and as monstrous and devastating as the Iraq war was, in terms of the immediate death toll of Iraqis, its impact on US strategic interests, the way that things played out in the region with the rise of ISIS and everything else, a war with Iran can have even more catastrophic consequences because Iran is an infinitely bigger country with a far larger missile capabilities that can impact many countries in the region. And the future looks very uncertain if things are allowed to drift in that direction. That is the political moment we're in. An authoritarian president domestically who was destroying free speech and the economic well-being of this country and is attacking judges, a policy of supporting genocide abroad, and the possibility of a catastrophic regional war. The only sign of hope that I can think of, I mean, you don't want to end a talk like this about how dire and desperate everything looks. You want to look for signs of hope. And the only sign of hope that I can see from where I'm sitting is the fact that younger Americans understand why all of this is awful. They are not in power yet, but the future looks more promising 20 years from now for what the direction of American policy is going to be. The threat is, can we make it that far? What happens between now and then? And that is the urgency that we face right now, in that every single person's voice is desperately needed to preserve what we have right now before it completely falls apart. And that is why every minute counts. It used to be that it's important to protest because every year that goes on, something horrible happens. In this case, every minute that goes on, there's more death and destruction of lives in Gaza, a more serious assault on civil liberties here at home. And so this is a moment of urgency that even in the face of such dark dangers, without a clear map for how we get out of this during the Trump administration, we cannot afford to sit on the sidelines. We cannot afford to throw our hands up. Hopelessness in this moment is a non-starter. It's not an option. Because if we're going to fight for a future for our children and for future generations, it is incumbent on all of us to take the urgency of this moment seriously and to do absolutely everything that we can to even just present hope and light a candle in the darkness and show that there's still going to be a force for resisting an unjust world and fighting to make it a better or more worthwhile place. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you.